most interesting conversation than anything interesting to me.
It's the question that's most interesting. I have nothing to say. Cassie? I'm sorry, Stacy, go ahead.
Well, I'm asking that because when there's the invitation to ask questions, when there are questions that are floating around in the mind, something inside kind of steps back and evaluates or checks in with, I don't know, the quality of the question. And so I'm just wondering, is there any value in discerning the value of a question? Maybe just a question about the different, that's all.
I can't say I completely understand your question. When Kazem's son passed, and I remember Saeed calling me saying that Behrang had died. He had a heart attack and died, 17. So when a bunch of us went into, to their house, and his mother Mina, Kazem is very stoic. Cassie has been to their house plenty of times. Even when his son had passed away, he didn't really show much emotions. But his mother Mina, she was just screaming. And the room was really, really charged. And because of the passing of the son, and because of the way that she was, questions would just not come up. The grief and the intensity and the sadness was so intense that in a very strange way your mind just shut off. I mean, sure, you could be curious about how did he pass. He was so young, But those questions didn't really get a chance to come to the surface. None of us had any questions. All we could do was just sit back and listen to the mother and then cry once in a while. And it was much more difficult for us men to kind of just express ourselves through tears. We just sat there trying to contain ourselves. A couple of days had passed, and things had to kind of become a bit more political, in the sense that we had to go to the mortuary, we had to go to Home Depot and buy some fabric or cloth. We had to figure out which location in the cemetery that this young man was to be buried. Mina couldn't involve herself in that, the mother. Those questions didn't matter for her. The grief was far too much. Kazim was able to talk about that just a little bit, not too much. It was mostly his brother Saeed. So, we went to Home Depot and a couple of other places. And that was because Saeed could be a bit more detached. And when you're detached, you can ask questions. And in some ways, it's really good to have those people around because they can kind of deal with certain facts of life, because the parents are completely paralyzed. And luckily for them, they had like 3 sisters or 2 sisters and a few other friends who could kind of deal with the politics of this. When time had passed, and by that I mean a few years, I remember Mina sitting with her, and then she said a few things about what had happened and how it happened and how Behrang had a heart that wasn't functioning well from childhood. And it was a different way of expressing grief, but it no longer came with any tears or screaming. And I think within the context of your question, I think by the time you get to a place where your questions have so much depth and intensity, when you're confused, you can ask questions, you write them on a piece of paper, you take them somewhere, and you kind of say, well, I have this question. Something about you desires to understand. It doesn't mean that they lack emotions, but it's mostly for the sake of understanding. There comes a point where you don't really care to understand anything. There is nothing to understand. Because even if you were to understand what you're searching after is so grand, being somewhat poetic, that your question and your understanding is like a drop of water in the middle of nowhere. You come to a place where you say, well, so what? Okay, so I understand that, for example, I don't know, in the Gospel of Mark, ABCD happens to Jesus. It's a nice understanding, but if you want to know and feel what lives inside this man, and if you want those things to also live inside you, that understanding means nothing. It has no value. And you come to a place where you realize that. So if I was to kind of go back in time, when we were going to Hussein's gatherings, we all had questions. And then we all had notebooks in which we had written our questions prior to going to his house. And it started with Hussein, my mom's cousin. And then Mehrdad started bringing his notebook, and then I started bringing a notebook, and that continued for about a couple of years. And it's important and it's necessary, I think, at the beginning. Because inwardly you're still quite raw. You have no idea. Things are interesting for you, but you don't really know how or why. And you're also very curious. Everything you read, brings about many, many questions. It was also good for our gatherings because it lessened the work on I still carried my notebook, and Mehrdad also carried his notebook, but Hussein didn't. He had stopped bringing his notebook. And once in a while he would ask questions. And mind you, he's right now 70, so he was about 10, 15 years older than the rest of us, than Mehrdad and I. And him and Hussein had a very unique relationship. They were very intimate, very close in many ways. Hussein had stopped asking questions. He was no longer wanting to experience things through language, through curiosity. He was just waiting for the rain to come, in the sense that he wanted an experience, and he had plenty of them. And slowly the same thing happened to Mehrdad and I. That there came a point after, I think, maybe 4, 5, 6 years that there wasn't really anything to ask. We would go there and he would say, "So, how are you doing?" And very quietly, it was like kind of like a whisper, "Fine, thank you." And we knew our place with Hussein, We couldn't joke around. And so he would kind of open up, Hafiz or some verses in the Quran, and then he would just talk about them for a few hours. Initially, you have no choice but to have questions, and those questions you assume them to be interesting, and they are, Then random questions evolve into very specific questions, and those specific questions have to do with how all these ideas are impacting you. What you should do about this or what you should do about that. And that's going to take place for a long, long time, because you have no idea what's happening to you in many ways. And then there comes a point where you're no longer fighting. You don't care about the questions. You kind of embrace the fact that in some ways your life is meaningless. You don't really know what to ask, and even if you did, it wouldn't really matter. And we were just there to enjoy Hussein's presence or his company and whatever it was that he would kind of talk about. And this is like in the 1980s. Mehrdad and I were very clean in the sense, and Hussein as well. Hussein was married, but he never brought his married life into the gatherings. There were no questions. Maybe he talked about them privately with Hussein, but not in front of the rest of us, Mehrdad and I had basically the confusion of just young kids, 19, 20-year-olds. What exactly is it that they do? Nothing. We're just trying to find a way to survive. None of us were in a relationship. None of us had any addictions. And so our questions didn't have any like hidden motives or agendas. You know, as we say in Persian, "Bedar migam ke divar beshnave." We were not asking a question about God so I could figure out my relationship with my brother, for example. It wasn't any of that. Um, so what I think the sort of questions that usually come up, if you were to kind of just take everything back to just the physical body that you have, and every physical body has its own unique physical environment, and that environment has all these forces. You have parental forces, you have forces that come to you through the media, just life experiences. All these forces create for you a set of feelings and emotions. It's unavoidable. All of us have it. Okay. Now, when you have those feelings and emotions, a couple of things begin to happen because they are confusing. Most of the feelings and experiences are kind of negative. You know, we don't want to go to school. We don't want to listen to our parents. We hate our jobs. Maybe you're in a relationship and you hate your relationship. So these are the forces of the physical environment. And so you have the body, you have the feelings and the emotions, and then on the top is you have a mind. This mind branches into two parts. The first unevolved mind tries to react to all the feelings and emotions that are being created by your environment. So it's a very political way of just using your mental abilities, and you have no choice because, again, you are to some extent unevolved, you are reactionary, and it's necessary if you want to survive life. There is a good amount of you that's really involved in all the questions that you're asking, and the you is the product of the physical environment. I can't remember a single time where we talked to Hussein about school, about job, about relationship, about loneliness. We never asked about any of those questions. It just didn't exist for us. And to some extent it was because we were such a tight community, you know. But none of those questions ever came up. So I'm not really quite sure how Hussein would handle it. Then there comes a stage in your life where this first mind kind of gets shut down and the second mind comes about, and it has a tendency of observing, not reacting. You know, why am I feeling this way? Why am I acting this way? Why am I speaking this way? And so it begins to kind of stand outside of itself and then look inside and ask a lot of questions. Okay. So the first, if we can incorrectly just say the first mind, you know, you want to solve the problems. The second mind wants to kind of figure things out, understand, and then solve the issues. Okay. So all the questions come from your ability to observe and the desire to deeply understand why these things are happening. Okay. Once you begin to kind of observe and understand, there is something else that happens. You have a series of questions that you ask and you want certain changes to happen. The problem after this mind that observes and reflects is that there is this other part of you that just doesn't yet exist, and that's your will, your ability to take the components of your understanding and put it in the right place so changes can happen. Will is very, very difficult because you have to overcome so many things, you know. And the older you are, the more difficult it's going to get. And so you have a series of questions that come from the fact that you keep trying, but you keep failing. For example, you know you shouldn't drink. You've observed that because you've lost your wife, you've lost your husband, you've lost your children, you've kind of destroyed all of your relationships. You know it's bad for you. And so you want to stop drinking. The problem is it's a brand new you, it's a brand new life, it's a brand new way to behave. And all of this brand new stuff is sitting against like 30 years of drinking. It's nearly impossible. So all the questions that come up is, how can I do this? Why am I failing? Why am I getting depressed more and more and more as I try, as I fail more? So, you know, questions have all these different stages to go through, you know, until you get to a place where you just don't have any more questions to ask. And in some ways it's really, really good because there is this feeling of profound insignificance on your part, that it just doesn't matter what I ask. I am far too insignificant, far too small, far too incompetent to really, first of all, grasp any of this. Second, I don't care about understanding any of this. I simply want an experience, and you have no idea what to do to gain that experience. You know, what was her name? Emma Goldman. She was an anarchist. Emma Goldman was. She had a very abusive father, and we're talking, you know, old school people where you don't sit with your kids and kind of talk to them rationally. You kind of just say, don't eat ice cream, and you do, and they smack the heck out of you. And, you know, she said, despite all the abuses I suffered through the hands of my father, I loved him so much. And I wanted to express my love to him, and I wanted him to express his love for me, but I just didn't know how, she said. You know, and it's, I mean, I don't know much about her. I don't know if she ever got a chance to kind of sit with her father and say, listen, what do I need to do to kind of have you love me more? Instead of spanking me, why not just hug me? What do I need to do? And I think it was just something that the only thing that she could do was just to write it down. It's kind of a place of resignation that you can't really talk about this to your father. Just write it down. There's nothing else I can do. You know, and you hope that your father kind of maybe gets old, maybe gets sick, and then looks at you and says, I'm really, really sorry. And that could be kind of your release, your salvation to some extent. You know, it's something that Cassie had said about this book, Haji Abdullah Ansari, where he stands to pray. He says to God, you know, I want to pray and I want to ask you questions, but you're in my heart. You already know my questions. You already know my difficulties. You already know my suffering. If you think I'm worthy, then, you know, give me the answer. Provide the experience. I don't want to open my mouth and ask questions. I think you find that in Daughter of Fire, maybe page 700 and after, where she's become content and satisfied. What we say in Persian and Arabic, razi. That you accept your misery in a very mature way. You don't ask questions, you don't demand anything, you just go about your business. You know. But I think these are just stages that we just have to go through. If you're having a lot of doubts, for example, it's difficult to not have questions and to not have the negative feelings and emotions. And out of those feelings and emotions, you will have lots of questions, lots of ways to express yourself. One of the difficulties about talking in this way is that sometimes you want to ask a question, for example, and then you say, wait a minute, maybe I shouldn't ask questions. What can really be gained from asking questions? And then one can falsely place oneself, at a stage or a station that one doesn't really belong. And most of this stuff is really quite intuitive. It's kind of organic. There really comes a point where you very, very genuinely and sincerely just don't have any questions. As we did, we had no questions, but we knew that we need to go to Hussein's house, a few times a week, for example, even though we had no questions. My grandmother passed, 5-6 years ago maybe. They still go to the cemetery, they wash a tombstone, they pray and they go home. The first couple of years after her passing, they would call my mom every Friday from the cemetery. And they would say to my mom, if you want to pray, you can do so right now. We have the phone, on the tombstone. Then after a while, that desire to call my mom disappeared. They were just content with only themselves going to the cemetery, doing what they need to do, and then going home. So if on the inside you feel like you have questions, you have doubts, then you need to ask. And by need, I mean you can express it in any way that makes you feel comfortable. If you get to a place where there are really no questions and someone is forcing you to ask a question, for example, you come here, you sit. It's kind of like the way I harass Jackie sometimes. So Jackie, do you have any questions? 7:05 says, no, I don't have any questions. 7:15, so Jackie, do you have any more questions? And you're kind of put in a situation as, Hussein did that to us a couple of times. You just come up with something that's meaningless, but you ask anyways. Sometimes the questions are about you, and sometimes you get to a place where the questions have nothing to do with you. It's really about sometimes other people, Sometimes it has to do with how you can express certain feelings and emotions and ideas. Uh, and I think if you come to a place of understanding that has a good amount of wisdom and reflection in it, the next difficulty facing you is how am I going to express all of this? How am I going to communicate? You don't even ask it. What usually happens is someone comes to you accidentally. Maybe you're sitting in your room and your sister asks a question, say about, I don't know, my boyfriend is mean. And you want to get her to a place where she can look at relationships in a different way. But because you don't really have that background, you haven't practiced that, you're going to stumble. And so for the next few months or years, you're going to be asking questions. And that could happen by you wanting to read books to get more insights, talking to various people, you know. So the questions no longer really involve you. What they involve is how can you best express certain reflections in a way that others can kind of understand. And by the time you kind of understand that, you realize you're 70 and your body's failing, and the questions will be all about you again, you know. Hussein was very lucky. You know, that all the questions that were asked of him were questions that he inspired. You know. And because his mind was always in poetry and sacred texts, it never came down here. It was not earthly. It was not fleshy. So most of his desires and ambitions kind of just went inside the three of us, you know, and all of us kind of took in according to our own capacities, and then our questions had to do with his interests. You know, so if, for example, in an hour you ask, well, how do I talk about all of this to my boyfriend, for example, I would say, I don't really care. And your question to some extent would tell me that talking about this stuff really is just a waste of time. Because I don't really care about your personal life. That's not interesting for me. And even if it was, there isn't much you can do. You know, you, for example, chose your boyfriend when you were stupid. Now you're a little evolved, and now you want to change your boyfriend. Well, that's not going to happen. So, sorry. But it takes a long time, and you have to be protected. I was talking to a friend of mine a couple of days ago. Uh, she's going to Yale, you know, and she was just in such a bad shape because she hates it there. I mean, she wants to kind of just drop the whole thing. And I kept telling her that, listen, when you're done with this degree in a couple of years, wherever you go, you can. Whatever college or university you want to teach, you can. You have Yale after your name. But she couldn't see that far ahead because Yale was just demolishing her, you know. She really dislikes the classes, hates the classes and the conversations and the books that she has to read and the essays that she has to write. She just really hates them. And so what happens when you put yourself in the wrong environment, all of a sudden the questions that you had never asked, all of a sudden you begin to ask, and they begin to dominate your psyche, you know. I think that's one of the reasons why you have, kind of secret societies or cults or various groups where the individuals and their minds are protected so that just ridiculous questions. I mean, they're important difficulties, you know. I mean, you're going to Yale. How can I just finish the degree? You know. Then you kind of have to pamper and babysit, you know, because every time this person breaks down, you have all these questions coming up. And it takes a lot of energy tending to these questions that really, they're important. I mean, I asked them when I was younger, but now at this stage I don't really care. You want to drop out, you can drop out, but you should know that, life is not going to offer you anything better. It's kind of like when you get older, and you've been single for a long time. And when you're single, your questions are interesting. Should I become vegan? Should I buy a Tesla or a Toyota? Those are interesting questions. And you have, headaches. Then at the age of 70, for example, or 60, you get into a relationship. And all of a sudden, this man, this woman opens their suitcase and all this garbage comes out. And all of a sudden, your life turns upside down. And you say to yourself, after being with this person for a couple of weeks or months, you say, single life was difficult. But I would go home, watch TV, and maybe drink a little and go to sleep. Now, I'm with this man or this woman. We fight all the time. I'm agitated, I'm stressed, I can't sleep, I can't even enjoy drinking. And you kind of just go back to being single. And I think it's important to kind of pay attention to the questions that you're asking, because it also reveals to you where your physical body is being located and what sort of forces are assaulting it, and what sort of feelings and emotions are being created. Because to solve them, it requires energy. Some things are just not worth doing, Hussein, he was in coma for about, 2-3 months. He's feeling much better. My parents were away, so I had to go to Roseville a couple times last week. And so my mom called and said, why don't you go and buy him this and buy him that? Now remember, we'd been good friends for about 20, 30 years. I'm not in a place where I want to sit and talk to anybody about their life. I don't care. It doesn't matter who it is. I'm willing to give money away, but not my time or energy. So I just went to Costco, bought him some stuff, gave him. He comes out to my car. He says, my tree is not looking well. I kind of cut some branches. I said my goodbyes and I left. I can't do much about his cholesterol. I don't really care. He doesn't have the will or even the resources to fix his life. I'm not really that interested in his life. So him and me sitting and him asking all these questions, for me, is irrelevant.